everyone. In today's video, I'm going to be looking back at my postpartum experience and sharing why it was actually more difficult than I thought it was. So that might sound a little bit weird, but while it was happening, the first year after I gave birth, I thought that things were going really well. I thought that I was doing well. And I think that's probably the image I projected onto this channel as well, that, I was doing really well and things were going really smoothly. And that was true to an extent, but I think upon reflection and, hashing it out more with Rob and looking back at how I was actually coping and doing and managing everything, that was more difficult and challenging and a little rough than I had thought it was. I'm going to start off by talking about the factors that contributed to these challenges or feeling like it was hard, and then go into, how that actually played out, the effects that it had on my life and what exactly I was struggling with or using as maladaptive coping. So I think this is kind of true for anyone postpartum, is that there are changes in hormones and, you get a lot less sleep because you're getting up to feed the baby and tend to the baby all hours. And then, of course, there is the change in routine to kind of just no routine. And it feels like you're always just reacting to your baby's needs as opposed to having, a set schedule that you follow like you did before you had the baby. And so those are just kind of common challenges that everyone goes through that can be really difficult to navigate. And I think that lead to a lot of postpartum issues. But on top of that, all of this happened during COVID, during a global pandemic. And so when I had my baby, Teddy, we were really, really isolated because it was during kind of the peak of when restrictions were happening. And so we really weren't able to see really anyone, and we weren't able to get that external support from friends and family to help navigate the first few months or the first year or, just at all. We didn't have that external physical support. It was also kind of an interesting additional challenge that this was my first time having a baby and taking care of a baby and whatnot, but I also had 2 older kids to look after as well. And so that was a really big juggling act and a really steep learning curve, I guess, to figure out how to balance looking after all 3 of the kids, including one small infant, as well as myself and my husband, and keeping up with everything. And that was really, really difficult. And I think probably was harder than I thought it would be too. This YouTube channel is also what I do for work. So I don't have a typical job in the sense of having, paid maternity leave. I kind of had to keep working as soon as the baby, throughout the whole pregnancy, as soon as the baby was born and all throughout the first year and beyond. And so I never got, just a break just to focus on the baby and focus on healing and recovery and whatnot. It was kind of like I just had to jump right back into work. And so that was another element that required juggling as well. And then, of course, medications throughout my pregnancy were a challenging component of pregnancy. I shared a bit about it in other videos, but there was a lot of different, titrating of doses and whatnot that needed to happen throughout my pregnancy. And then that kind of continued afterward too. I had to try to re-regulate my medications post-pregnancy as well. And so that was an additional challenge that I faced postpartum. Changing medications might not sound like a big deal, but when I am changing, psychiatric medications, it often comes with the onset of symptoms, more symptoms than I'm typically dealing with. So, increased hallucinations, delusional thinking, sometimes paranoia, differences in mood. And so that all is a lot to juggle and, navigate at the same time as all of this newness of having a new baby and juggling everything that I just mentioned. And so all of these, pressures and challenges just kind of accumulated to me not really feeling a sense of control over my life. And so I think that is the ultimate, essence of what led to me really struggling. I think that that's a really common experience for new parents, is that this kind of loss of control over your own life, because now this little being that's in your life is kind of calling the shots and kind of controlling the direction of your life, what you spend your time on, what consumes you. It's them. They're kind of taking over. And, that's okay. You're coming at this from a place of love and you want to take care of this little person, but it's still very hard to kind of come to terms with that and to figure out how to still take care of yourself with that being your reality. And then, of course, all of the mental health challenges that I was facing as well just kind of made this even harder. And so, like I said, this was kind of the essence of what compelled me to fall into kind of maladaptive coping strategies, because I became very fixated and kind of obsessed on certain things that I was using to cope. The first one that kind of came about postpartum was kind of a fixation on my body image. I've shared in past videos that I have struggled with an eating disorder in the past, and it kind of, I think there's a lot of factors that triggered, falling back into disordered eating habits. One being the extreme changes in my body that come with pregnancy. And then, kind of the societal pressure to lose the weight again right away and get back to your pre-pregnancy body played a role. And I think I guess you could say lucky that a lot of weight came off very quickly for me post-pregnancy. I didn't have to do much. And other people took notice of this, and they would compliment me on that. And they would make comments on how great I was looking, weeks after giving birth. And I took that as, compliments of me succeeding. And I took that as, a marker of how well I was doing postpartum. And I became fixated on that for all of these reasons. And I really, kind of started to obsess over my food intake and exercise and, having some semblance of control over that component of my life. Having experience managing disordered eating in my past kind of led me to be able to have a bit more insight into how this was a problem. And, Rob talked a lot about it with me too. And I realized that it was something that I did not want to fall deeper into like I have in the past. And so I brought it up with my therapist. I worked on it and whatnot. And I guess I moved past it or moved into a healthier space around that. But I kind of moved right into a different maladaptive coping mechanism. I had stopped breastfeeding because it wasn't working out. And so I was able to drink more. And then, I don't know, it was summer. It was probably more difficult than I was acknowledging to cope. I was having increased symptoms of, my schizoaffective disorder, and it just started feeling good having a couple drinks, a drink or two every day. And that was kind of what I started using as a means of coping. And that itself became kind of an obsessive, maladaptive coping strategy too, which I fell into. And so the cycle repeated itself, and I realized, wait, this isn't super healthy, and this is not something that I want to fall deeper into either. So again, brought it up with my therapist. We worked on it, moved forward. I was like, okay, I want to be in a healthier mindset in terms of this. So left that behind me, and I moved forward into another maladaptive coping strategy. I became, kind of fixated and obsessed again on like online shopping. And, I used that as a self-soothing technique, that I had used first eating and exercise and restriction and stuff on, and then drinking, and then now online shopping. And, I wasn't totally aware through all of this that there was something present that I was needing to cope with using all of these maladaptive coping strategies. And I think I kind of remained oblivious or maybe in denial about this for a very long time, up until probably recently, and maybe still a little bit of obliviousness going on here. And I kind of wonder if there was some anosognosia at play throughout all of this too, where I was experiencing increased symptoms and I was struggling with my mental health, but I wasn't really aware, and I didn't have the insight into the fact that I was struggling with those things with my mental illness. I kept saying, I'm doing really, really well postpartum. Things are going really well. I'm coping well. I am on top of everything. And that just wasn't the whole truth. There was a lot of things that I was struggling with too. And so part of this might have been anosognosia, but I think another contributing factor here was that I was experiencing kind of a prolonged period of a little bit of mania. And that kind of goes along with the mood component of my schizoaffective disorder, bipolar. And I think I was in a prolonged period of, hypomania, just below mania, where you have elevated mood, elevated energy, just kind of excitedness about everything. And I felt like I was taking on more in my life and I was excited about it. I thought everything was going really well. And in hindsight, I think that was partly the hypomania. And that was kind of partly why I had this kind of rose-colored vision of how I was doing postpartum. I think pre-pregnancy and during my pregnancy, I was primarily really, really worried about postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis. And so when I wasn't experiencing, postpartum depression or, full-blown psychosis postpartum, I thought, hey, I avoided those things. I'm doing well. But I think the reality is that there are a multitude of ways that someone can struggle postpartum. And, I think I was really struggling with my mental health in other ways that I maybe wasn't as aware of or wasn't looking out for as diligently. So that's kind of why I thought that I was doing really well. But in reality and in hindsight, maybe I wasn't actually doing as well as I thought I was. So if you are living with a mental illness like schizophrenia and you are considering having a child, I think that some, tips for the postpartum process are really, what helped me was to stay in close contact with your psychiatrist and with your therapist primarily, so that maybe you can catch these, warning signs or difficulties or challenges that you're experiencing that maybe are beyond or don't fall within postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis, which is the two main things that you hear talked about all the time and, you're warned about. I also just wanted to kind of be more honest about, challenges that I experienced postpartum. My pregnancy journey was not easy. And, I worry sometimes that I glossed over it a little bit too much with the channel and, just kind of presented that it went really well and, I flourished through it all, because that's not fully true. It did present some very real and very challenging difficulties, both during pregnancy and postpartum, probably more so postpartum. And so I just wanted to kind of help to paint a little bit more honest, of a picture of what my postpartum experience has been like. So thank you so much for watching this video. I would love to hear about your experiences or difficulties or challenges postpartum or triumphs postpartum in the comments below. Also, if you feel that you would benefit from online peer support, make sure to check out the link to our Patreon page in the description below. Once you become a patron, you gain access to our online peer support community where we offer peer support through various means, including weekly peer support groups. Or if you're just looking for a way to support our channel, becoming a patron is a great way to do that too. So make sure to check out the link to our Patreon page in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, wishing you and your loved ones good health. We'll see you in the next video. Bye.